So I'm Penny Carlton with the Proctor and Coordinating Center at CIMMYT. And before I introduce our speakers, just a few reminders. The session, as you know, is recorded. It will be archived with a PDF of slides or a PowerPoint of slides on the Proctor website, www.proctrn.org. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. So please put your questions in the chat box or be prepared to raise your hand and we'll recognize you. There is closed captioning for those of you that are interested. It's just in the menu at the bottom of your screen. So now let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Brian Walsh. He's the Radix Accessibility Program Manager for Radix. He's also the Deployment Core Team Lead. He's responsible for management and resourcing of all the Radix tech teams. He has a bachelor and master's degree in bioengineering from UC San Diego and a master's of business administration from Emory. He has 35 plus years in tech development and commercialization experience for Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices. Claire O'Donovan, also in Radix, a Radix team leader. She holds a BS degree and a PhD from University College Cork, Ireland. She has 30 plus years of experience in the medical device and diagnostic industry with extensive global business and leadership experience in quality, global manufacturing, and supply chain, remediating quality systems and leading due diligence and integration efforts. Highlights of her career include serving as Vice President of Quality and Regulatory Diagnostic Imaging at Royal Philips and as Senior Vice President of Quality and Regulatory Affairs at Beckman Coulter. Emily Kennedy is a Radix project facilitator. She holds a BA degree in International Relationships from Colgate University and a PhD in Integrated Bioscience from the University of Akron. She has 10 plus experience in entrepreneurship, innovation consulting, and program design and development. She's an inventor on multiple patents and has co-authored research articles, opinion pieces, and invited columns with hundreds of collective citations. And finally, John Blackwood, also with Radix team leader. He has a BS degree in biochemistry from the University of Massachusetts, an MS in clinical chemistry from Northeastern University, and an MBA from Worcester Polytech. He has over 40 years of experience in the IVD industry, holding senior positions at both multinational corporations and startup companies. John has invented and patented multiple IVD devices, including early patents in thin film immunoassay techniques and hapten antibody development. So welcome to all of you, and why don't I turn the floor over to you, Brian.
Great, thank you, Penny. So perhaps we could go to the first slide just for a second, Adam. Thank you. Or the other first slide, maybe. Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility best practices. As Penny described, this is our second webinar. The first was more about the program and the processes we're employing to work with the Radix teams. This is more about what we've captured and learned and how we're trying to perpetuate that into the future. Can you go ahead to slide 2, please? So I'll be talking about the framework briefly and then turn it over to Claire. Slide 2, please. I'll turn over to Claire. Claire leads the best practices initiative inside of accessibility, and she'll be supported by both Emily and John. So why don't you go to slide 3, please? I did want to comment briefly about the Radix accessibility team because this effort is a team effort and it involves a lot of different resources. And this is a pretty high energy, committed group that have asked to do all kinds of different things, most of which they've never done before. And it's without their help and effort, we wouldn't have the progress that we've had. So I just want to recognize them. Should we go ahead to slide 4, please? So here's an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'll talk about the program briefly, and then Claire's going to talk about testing workflow and best practices. Emily's going to talk about instructions in digital design, and then John's going to give the other side of the coin, the part where when we talk to various companies and ask them to participate in this program, how they respond, what they think, and what they actually do. And he'll kind of give that perspective as well, kind of balance it all out. Should go to slide 5, please. So let me give you the program overview on slide 6. So this is the overall RADx program. This program was stood up in, I believe, April 2020. And the goal was to speed the innovation and development, commercialization, and implementation of technologies for COVID-19 testing. And you can read for yourself, but over 4 billion tests and products were provided. And I think this number actually is low now. It's north of 50 FDA authorized tests. And it was the first over-the-counter test for use at home. And it supported more than 100 different organizations. So that was the overall program, which was quite large. Should go ahead, please. Out of that came in a push by advocacy groups in the first quarter of last year. And in that push, they asked the White House to make the tests that they were providing by the US government more accessible. They essentially said the tests weren't accessible and it was very, very challenging to use. So there was a listening session in March 2022 that started this program. It was sponsored by the NIH and CIMMYT. And the goals were to understand challenges to the accessibility of at-home tests, discuss potential improvements, including timescale, and open lines of communications for ongoing discussions. And there were 3 user populations identified. There was a no vision, low vision population, those with fine motor skills difficulties, and aging populations, though aging populations cross over into many other areas. And there was a list you can see for yourself of advocacy attendees as well as government agencies that attended this first meeting. We've kept these meetings going on a monthly basis since that time and meet with these advocacy groups and give them regular updates so that they can see what's going on. And we also use their input and their experience of kind of living this experience to help guide us on how to do it the best way we can. Go ahead to slide 8, please. So as part of that initiative, we stood up the best practices program. And when we started, we kind of looked around and tried to figure out what is out there. And we found extremely limited standards or guidances, which is the normal way you would approach trying to create something. You try to say, what are the standards that I can comply with? There was almost nothing. But what we did have as we started to work through the process was rich informations and learnings from our own program. We learned all kinds of things. We had subject matter experts that were from the advocacy groups. We had designers from various accessibility design firms, and we learned all kinds of new things. But at the same time, we realized these would perish when the RADx program expires. So we stood up the Best Practices Initiative. And the objective was to capture and leverage learnings and experience from the RADx Tech Accessibility Program for current and future tests. It provides a roadmap for industry to build more accessible products. And we've documented the learnings and processes. We're going through validation of these. So it isn't just a paper exercise. We actually make prototypes and validate them with users from these populations. And then we execute using processes and resources to ensure that these are the right processes, these are the right resources to ensure the effectiveness of what we do. So it's a kind of a ringing out, if you will, of the process that we've created. And the target audience for this work are commercial manufacturers and designers. So it's very much focused on helping industry get it right. Should go ahead to slide 9, please. And I'll turn it over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Brian. And as Brian has shared, there's been a wealth of really rich information emerging from the accessibility program. And this is going to be captured as part of the best practice document to be published in May of this year. So I'm going to give you a sneak preview of some of the elements of that, some of the content that we will be including in that. But before I do that, I would really like to just talk a little bit about the testing workflow, and that's on the next slide, slide number 10. So really, in order to come up with an effective accessibility solution, you need to look at the process end to end. And in this case, that means from acquisition of the product or the kit through disposal of the kit components. And as shown on this slide, you have a series of icons that represent each of the steps on this process, from actually purchasing or acquiring the kit, through accessing, getting into the contents, sample collection, handling, running the test itself, how do you read the results, and the disposal of the components. And these sections have particular areas of importance, such as labeling and packaging under sample acquisition, liquid transfer and handling under sample handling, running the test, what are the recommendations for the cassette and the test reader, and reading the results as well. And in the best practices document, there will also be topics that span the entire process, from holistic design through regulatory, design control, braille, and really the importance of engaging end users. Next slide, please, Adam. So let's kick it off with packaging. And when we think of packaging, we think of protecting the contents of the package, but the packaging has another function, and that is it's the really first introduction of the kit and what it does to the actual user. We've seen some significant issues with packaging, including that much of the packaging is actually filled with random information. QR codes are either missing or insufficiently sized, and there are no tactile features to guide or locate any of these significant information on the actual packaging itself. So key recommendations emerging from the program include identifying the key pieces of information, and less is better, that you want to put on your kit. And this will obviously be company dependent, but it can include areas like the brand name, the device type, the expiration date, customer service phone number, for example. Really, QR code should be easily identifiable through either a raised sticker or a raised outline. And from one key area here that I just want to mention before I leave is the expiration date. Strong recommendation not to use numerics on the expiration date, but use something as is shown in the graphic here on the slide, where you incorporate text as well as numerics. Next slide, please. And this seems a seemingly trivial area. How do you access the contents of the kit can prove remarkably difficult for all users, not just the target users here. In some instances, too much force is required to open the kit. It's hard to access the content because the openings are too little. Most manufacturers use tamper-proof labels. Unfortunately, most of these labels are clear. So when you find them, you have to try and get through them. And in many cases, the solution to this inaccessibility is the use of scissors and knives, which is obviously highly problematic. Our recommendations include not using more than £5 to apply, not needing to apply more than £5 to actually open the box. The top of the box must be really as wide as possible to allow easy access to the content, and really provide familiar cues on the packaging. And you can see several examples of this, where you have a strip that you pull. We are all familiar with this in terms of FedEx. I probably shouldn't mention FedEx, but as an example of where you open an envelope, cake box, for those of us who like to frequent the bakery, and also a notch on the right-hand side as well. So moving on to the next slide. This is actually a really interesting area and has proven to be a source of remarkably rich information. And we see that swabs are a universal opportunity for improvement. However, swabs are really standard, are very cost sensitive. They're pretty much standard and off the shelf, and they come from very large scale manufacturers. And this is an example where a short-term solution and a long-term solution need to be balanced as part of this and other programs. But what are the issues with swabs? One key issue is that the packaging of swabs, we call it secondary packaging, contains little information as to which end you open. So 50% of the time, you can potentially open the wrong end, grasping the sterile end of the swab and potentially misusing the swab as a result. So our recommendations are to have for all swabs to have identifiable features. These can be colors, shapes, different textures, so that the user can actually know where to grasp and prevent sample contamination. And equally with regard to the secondary packaging, or pouches as we refer to them as here on the right-hand side of the graphic, You can see that there's an obvious tear line with a large obvious notch, so you know which end to open and thus prevent misuse of the swab. Next slide, Adam. And probably one of the key areas is the whole area of liquid containers and liquid transfer. You know, vials are multi-purpose. They hold liquid, but they also receive the swab, and the swab contains the sample and are thus a vessel for sample extraction as well. Properly designed, they can facilitate docking and provide a means for gross or precision liquid handling. And let me just stop on that for a second. We refer to precision handling as the counting of drops. Many of the kits that are out there call for, you know, may add 3 drops to the sample window or add 6 drops or whatever. So we refer to this as precision liquid handling. Gross precision is where you expel the entire contents of the tube into the onto the sample window or into the sample cassette. So there are several issues with use of liquid containers. It's remarkable how many of these vials are small and the caps are teeny as well. And obviously, and they're clear, so they can be easily misplaced. In other instances, the caps are practically impossible to remove from the tube. And some vials are very lightweight and thus can be easily tipped over. There have been many recommendations as to how to address this situation. Add color to the cap in certain situations so that if indeed the worst happens and it is misplaced, you can easily locate it. Tether the cap to the vial so that you can prevent that from happening at all. Incorporating a stand or a tray to prevent the vial from tipping over, or indeed in some instances add a wider base to the tube, again to achieve the same result. And always remember that the vial opening needs to be large enough to receive the sample and needs to be really married to the swab size that you're using. Next slide. And I think I've covered many of these areas already in the previous slide. But again, just re-emphasizing the liquid transfer is a potential for spillage. But as important and probably more important, error-free counting of drops is extremely difficult. That is precision liquid transfer. And our strongest recommendation is, where possible, to eliminate the precision liquid transfer, to design your test to allow for use of the entire contents of the fluid vial. That is an optimum situation. Well, the optimum situation is just to add the sample and have no liquid transfer. But to ensure smooth liquid transfer, docking of the parts is another obvious solution, another obvious recommendation. But absent all of these, then make sure that your instructions are clear and comprehensive. Cannot overstate the need to have clear instructions in this instance. And next slide, please, Adam. So let's talk about cassettes and test readers. They come in all shapes, sizes, and types, as you can imagine, as you're all aware. From some tests being self-contained, and you know, it's simply a visual read of lines off an LFA. Some are accompanied by readers, and the readers themselves can also come in different shapes and sizes, from a standalone reader. Lots of evidence of that out there. Smartphones, or indeed in some instances, the reader is actually paired to the smartphone. One thing that we have seen is that there's a lot of confusion on terminology, and really words matter in this situation. So a recommendation is really always define the component you're describing. And we typically refer to the actual test device as the cassette, and the reader is a test reader, not an analyzer as it's sometimes called. And the next slide, please. And just a few points on the cassette and the test reader. Always consider the use of non-visual indicators or non-visual cues to guide taking the test and reporting the results if required. Examples of these non-visual clues would include beeps, audible voice, haptic feedback. Our feedback from our SMEs is generally that audible voice and haptic is an optimum solution for those with no vision, low vision, and hearing impairment. And a few words in conclusion on the use of smartphones. I think it's really important to recognize that not everybody has, wants, or can afford a smartphone. And examples of this would be the aging population and the economically disadvantaged. Orientation for taking photographs is really critical, and always use technology that already exists. Don't reinvent the wheel if it's not necessary. Providing auditory haptic device positioning and camera visibility feedback, such as the test has been identified, or perhaps failed, move your camera, move your smartphone closer, or failed, increase the brightness. These are all very helpful in guiding the user to achieve a successful result. And always remember that standalone readers with optional smart technology is required. So having one size fits all doesn't really work for the users, for any users, and for the users that are in scope here today. So with that, I will hand over to Emily, who's going to take us through instructions in digital design.
Thank you, Claire. Yep, so now we're going to shift our discussion to physical and digital instructions for use, both of which are important ways to convey information. And digital instructions are especially useful for no vision and low vision users. Slide 19, please. The RADx Accessibility Program leverages a partnership with Georgia Tech HOMELAB to perform preliminary usability and accessibility evaluations of COVID home tests. And these evaluations consist of an expert review of the kit components, the test protocol, and the instructions for use. So for each test, HOMELAB conducts a task analysis to identify which tasks are essential to success, and among those essential tasks, which are accessible, meaning they can be completed successfully by a majority of users, including those who are no vision, low vision, have fine motor skill difficulties, or are aging. And interestingly, a majority of accessibility issues that were identified by HOMELAB were related to instructions, making this a prime opportunity area for manufacturers to improve accessibility. Slide 20, please. Some of the issues identified with printed instructions included use of small, hard to read fonts that have poor color contrast, workflow steps involving multiple actions or tasks that are tricky to remember, and layouts with inconsistent reading direction. These issues can be readily addressed through consistent use of size 14 point or larger sans serif font, using text and background color combinations that facilitate legibility, like those that are pictured on the bottom right of this slide, presenting workflow steps as single actionable tasks, and sticking to a uniform columnar layout where the columns are read left to right. This columnar layout creates a logical flow, and it's much easier to scan on a flatbed scanner for digital tiling. So these recommended revisions to printed instructions are fairly straightforward. They require minimal investment, and they have large potential reward in terms of making products easier to use and thus more attractive to customers. Slide 21, please. Digital instructions are an even larger opportunity area for making home tests more accessible, especially to no vision and low vision users. First and foremost, these digital instructions must be rigorously tested for compatibility with commonly used screen readers, like the ones that are listed here on this slide. Screen readers, they convert text that's displayed on a computer, a tablet, or a phone screen into synthesized speech or a braille display. And screen readers also make it so images can be interpreted by no vision and low vision users, or really anyone who's unable to view images on a web page, by reading aloud the associated alternative, or for short, alt text. What alt text is it's written copy embedded in the HTML code that describes an image and its context. And it's important to note that alt text, it's more detailed than your average image caption, and it tends to rely on non-visual descriptors like shape, size, or feel. An important reference standard for digital instructions is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AA and PDF UA standards, with Section 508 compliance being the minimum legal requirement. Slide 22. Thanks. Smart technology also has great prospects for improving test accessibility and general usability. Something as simple as providing users with the option to review content in either landscape or portrait orientations is huge for someone who might have their phone mounted in a particular orientation on a wheelchair, for example. And smart technology can also prevent users from missing critical information by providing a pop-up message that would remain on the screen until the user actually acknowledges it. Smart tech should not reinvent the wheel. Claire touched on this. We don't need custom accessibility settings that could operate in a manner that's unfamiliar and unpredictable, but instead, smart tech should recognize and support built-in device operating system accessibility settings and tools to ensure a user experience that's familiar. Finally, since not everyone has access to smart tech, presenting instructions in other modalities like an interactive voice response phone system is also desirable. So with that, we can advance to slide 23 and I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Emily. You can move right to slide 24, please. So I'll be brief in this section and just highlight a few examples of how a few companies that were invited to participate in RADX's accessibility program responded to the invitation. Just want to caution that you shouldn't generalize responses to these types of companies because they're just 3 examples and they're not to be generalized. They're just examples. I as a RADX tech leader, had 3 very different types of organizations assigned to me in the accessibility program. And they all had similar reactions at the beginning, but in the end, after some discussion, their responses differed. And while not intuitively obvious, it might seem a little surprising at first when you put yourself in the shoes of those companies. It's really not that surprising. But 3 types of companies that responded at first the same way, but then maybe differently, or for sure differently. An example of a multinational publicly traded company, a privately held small company with a limited portfolio, lumpy sales, but nevertheless a going concern, and then a small startup entity with a novel technology that could be a true advance in accessible testing. You could move to slide 25, please. So the multinational publicly traded company. Invariably, every company responded at first saying, wow, this is important, right? There are 8% of the US population have some visual impairments, or 50% of adults over 70 have some form of manual dexterity issues. It's important that we have products designed for all of them. So that's the way it invariably started. And people wanted to be responsive, but then their businesses and they have their priorities. So the multinational, for example, started looking at it and said, okay, this is an area where we don't know how big the market is necessarily. Is it good for our business? Is it not? It's certainly good for a small segment of the business. But in the end, they need some management approval. And then when it really got down to let's get started, it was, we have other things to spend our time and money on right now. And while this is interesting and important, we have a queue of products lined up after everything's said and done that we kind of have to go to first, and it's probably not something we want to spend our time and money on. And I've run a large product development organization for a multinational, and I would have to say it's not that surprising to me. I had big budgets, but in the end, the list of things we needed to work on was always bigger than that budget could handle, and there was always a queue of the next things, and they had to be weighed against each other. So not surprising. The next slide, please, 26. A small company, they had between, say, 10 and $30 million of sales, but privately held. And they, of course, were enthusiastic. This is excellent, tell us more. And not only that, they weren't trying to figure out complicated business prioritization. They were in the COVID market already. They could see that eventually there'd be winners and losers in this market, and that this could differentiate them and help them proceed to the endemic phase of the pandemic. So they were saying, when can we send you documents to review? When can we get you examples of our packaging? How can we work with HOMELAB and do some studies and so on? And then in the end, at every step along the way, it's let's proceed with recommended changes. Only one caveat came up that we had to discuss, and that was, should we entertain a change that impacted form, fit, or function that might trigger refiling with the FDA and maybe a clinical trial even? That's something that we don't want to walk into blindly. We want to be aware of that, because as I think many people on this call are aware of, when you start getting into a large clinical study, it could be several to high single-digit $1 million, $2 to $5 million, depending on what type of study you're doing, perhaps even more. And for a small company with not a huge base of sales, they want to know that that's coming if they and walk into that decision knowingly and not mistakenly. But I'm eager to go and saw the value for both themselves and for those that need accessible testing. Slide 27, please. And then lastly, a small startup, no sales, a technology, really a true startup with a small kind of network team working on something. And they had the opportunity to make a decision before applying to Radix. Should we, they said to themselves, should we apply with this novel technology to Radix Tech 3 advanced technology or to Radix Tech 3 accessibility? And having seen their technology now as a team leader, it is novel and perhaps advanced, but they made the decision to say, look, at our technology is uniquely fit for accessible testing, and it is. And they decided, look, let's apply for the accessibility program. That's what we're about. That's what we're building. This is uniquely suited for that. And in taking them through the program, they basically same reaction. This is important. That's why we think this technology fits. We get it. But they also really didn't understand some of the things that Claire was talking about earlier on in this presentation about accessibility from the purchase point to the disposal point and everything in between. That hadn't been thought at all about this by this entity. They were looking at their technology in the middle of Claire's kind of continuum of accessibility and hadn't reached beyond the sides yet. But they realize that too, and they say, look, we want to succeed, and we're willing to adjust and change our project appropriately. And we're not experts in this accessibility design area. We do recognize our product fits it uniquely, but we need your help. We need the help of the accessibility program and Brian's team and the best practices and standards that have been designed. But how can we get started and how can we go faster? And it's not surprising either. So I think all three of these examples, while you might think at first that the large multinational is the company that will say, of course we'll do it, we have the money and all kinds of resources, they actually have a more disciplined decision-making process and queue of projects where a company looking to take a unique technology that fits the space, that's what they're geared to do and ready to do. And then a company kind of in the middle of those two. So I think I'll end it right there, and you can move to slide 28. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So you've seen the myriad of information that's emerged from the accessibility program. And I think all of us who've been involved in it would say it's been an absolute pleasure. And there are a lot of personal takeaways in addition to the overall program takeaways. And moving on to the next slide, synthesizing the essence of what we have learned and are taking away from this is not easy, but here's our best shot at it. And these are the messages we would like you guys to walk away with as well. So accessible design is a continuum, and it extends through the entire product experience from acquisition to disposal. So focusing on any one area at the expense of another does not lead to an accessible product. And as with most things, the overall accessibility of the product is only as good as the weakest link in the accessibility chain. The need to work with the target users in this instance is absolutely huge. And we have gotten such terrific feedback from our SMEs who represent the targeted user populations here of no vision, low vision, skills, motor skills issues or dexterity issues, and then those aging populations as well. And an example of this is that, you know, wearing an eye mask is really not a good surrogate or proxy for understanding the vision or understanding the need of a no vision or low vision user. You need to have those users give you direct feedback. And consistent with all good process design, accessible design begins with the requirements phase, where you listen to the voice of your target users, the voice of your customers in this instance. And probably from my perspective, the most important point of all is that an accessible solution, an accessible design is not different from a mainstream solution or mainstream design. Accessible design adds value to all users and shouldn't be seen as something different. Good science and technology, good design is the same in all of these cases. And then just in conclusion, where are we? Next slide, please. There was a need earlier in this program to publish a brief introduction to manufacturers as they were beginning the next generation of product, beginning their design work. And we issued an abbreviated form of the best practices document, recommendations document, with a focus on packaging and instructions. This document is available on the US Access Board website. And I'd like to take this time to give a real big shout out and a thank you to the US Access Board, who agreed to host our content, host our material. And even more than that, they actively engaged with us and collaborated with us in finding solutions to some last minute roadblocks and challenges that we encountered. So thank you all at the US Access Board. The feedback has been terrific and we're really delighted, we're really pleased about that. And we've had approximately 1,200 visits over the last 60 days, which we feel is really good news for the program. There will be a comprehensive version published in May of this year, late May, and these documents will be available in both online, are available online and accessible online in HTML and PDF format. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention here today.